Hello, Garland Nixon here. And in Zen, we have a saying that goes kind of like this. Everyone should meditate for 30 minutes a day unless they don't have time. And then they should meditate for an hour. Well, I'd say this about Joti Brar. Everyone who agrees with Joti Brar should watch my 1 hour show. Everyone who disagrees with her, should watch it for 2 hours and take notes. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Joti Brar on a Tuesday morning. We got a lot of important things to talk about, and let's get going right away. I named this "No Honor Amongst Imperialist Thieves" for a number of reasons, a couple of different reasons, but let's start with this. So Donald Trump supposedly strikes a deal with the Europeans, Ursula von der Leyen, and on its face, you look at the deal and you're like, he's taking them to the cleaners. Even off its face, he's taking them to the cleaners. But on top of that, then you look beneath the deal and you're like, yes, they're going to buy $750 billion worth of gas and stuff like that. And you look and you're like, but in that time period, the United States only sells $300 billion and $10 billion worth. So even if they had the money, which they don't, we don't have the product that they're going to buy. Oh, they're going to give $600 billion of investment. And then von der Leyen admits, well, we don't actually have the $6 billion. We're kind of hoping that these countries that are all closing down, because we're spending so much buying extra gas, energy, we were kind of hoping they'd do it, but of course they won't. So from one perspective, it's an absurd deal that makes no sense economically. From the other perspective, it's still a humiliation, and what little is actual real of the deal still is exceptionally detrimental to Europe. So that's why I put no honor amongst imperialist thieves. Your thoughts about the U.S. basically eating Europe for lunch as it deteriorates to maybe live a little bit longer before it starves.
Thanks, Garland. Yeah, there's a lot in what you were saying there, different strands of it. Sometimes you feel like some of this stuff is literally just like talking up the markets. It seems like a lot of things that the Trump regime does and says, and let's face it, they're just fronting for US finance capital. So we're at a point where the economic crisis is so bad that any way of restoring even confidence in the markets will postpone kind of total meltdown for another day, week, month. Enough time, maybe something else will turn up and help us. So I think there's a lot of that goes on. There's a lot of pumping up our position, saying we're going to do things we actually, if you stop and think about it, we can't do, like bring back all of our industrial production, for example. A lot of talking up. And part of it is about trying to restore confidence in markets. Let's not forget, not long ago, United Health, which is supposed to be a kind of safe haven, isn't it? A safe haven stock option for people that will always prosper because, they've got the US government over a barrel and they control most of the healthcare in the United States. And therefore they can't fail, too big to fail, all of that. They lost half of their stock market valuation in the space of less than a month. And almost nobody is really talking about it. We commissioned an article for our newspaper. Plug, it's just come out. The article will be online soon. It's in the printed copy. And I asked the author to kind of look around and see, is there much being talked about this? And the impression I get is there hasn't been a lot of talk about it. It's certainly, they're not putting these financial difficulties of the system front and center in the mainstream popular newspapers, in the financial press, and in the back kind of comment pages. There might be the odd word about it. But in terms of the mass understanding of the fact that we're in this huge financial crisis, they're doing everything they can to hide that from people, to conceal that. So I do think sometimes in some of these very hot air, kind of pronouncements that Donald Trump makes. Remember the deal with Ukraine? We're going to own everything, and and it's all nonsense, really, isn't it? But the kind of hot air aspect of it, I think we can't necessarily underestimate. If you're a sensible person who understands a little bit about real economics and the real geopolitical situation, it all looks kind of like nonsensical theatrics. But I think it does have a purpose in trying to bring back confidence to the markets. It also plays the role of trying to reassert American primacy. They're losing that. Like, the facts on the ground show that the USA is no longer the dominant power it was 20 years ago. Shows that no amount of bluster can assert its dominance over Russia, China, DPRK, Iran, Yemen, a whole bunch of places, the Sahel, a whole bunch of places they're losing their grip, Venezuela, right? Around the world, there are all these places where they've done everything they can, pulled out all the stops, and they're not able to reassert their primacy. And that means other countries who are watching start to think they've got options. So there's also a big part of the need to flex their muscles, show how strong they are, show that everybody ultimately has to bend the knee. So you might as well do it sooner rather than later. If you try and be independent, you're only going to regret it and things will just get worse for you. There's a lot of that, I think, in the pronouncements of this regime. Donald Trump is the perfect person to front up for that type of agenda, right? Because he's a showman. Right, he's basically a TV personality, isn't it? People talk about his art of the deal and all this crap, but what Donald Trump mainly is a TV personality, and he knows how to be a showman. He doesn't care if what he says today has got nothing to do with what he says yesterday. You just say it loudly and confidently, and all the people around you report it, respond to it, and then report it as if it all made sense, right? And that's all you need to keep the show on the road, right? That everybody around you pretends that the emperor's wearing clothes, and you prance about making stupid pronouncements that don't make sense in themselves, don't hang with all the other pronouncements you've made. Like, the whole thing makes no sense if you stop back. But we're just supposed to follow the show, right? And not think too hard about the ways that it all doesn't make sense. So I do think the talking up the markets and talking up American strength aspect shouldn't be underestimated to this whole thing. I think there's no way of telling right now whether this deal will ever be fulfilled, either in whole or in part. In the last year, the pronouncements of all the Western governments, the Europeans and the Americans, there have been a lot of headlines about a lot of things that they're definitely going to do, and a lot of very quiet retractions not very long afterwards, right? We were definitely going to send 20,000 troops, European troops, into Ukraine, weren't we? And how long did it take before we were quietly admitting that that's definitely not possible? And, people like us were saying it wasn't possible right in the beginning. But then, a month later, all the governments are saying, first their military people say it, and then there's a government press release, and it's reported on the back page of one or two serious newspapers. Oh, actually, we're probably not doing that after all, right? But the front page headlines have been made, and a lot of people, if they see anything at all about the story, it's literally just that, the front page headline. Again, you shouldn't underestimate the impact a lot of this have on the kind of general sense that people have about what's going on in the world and who's strong and powerful, and they just get the headlines. They get the headlines. They don't see the retraction. They don't see what went on afterwards, or what's the real substance of the whole thing. So there's no way of knowing if this deal is really going to happen. Yes, if it does, it's telling you something very significant about the relationship between the European imperialist powers and the USA. Now, this is something that's been ongoing since World War II. We've all been aware of it, that essentially it's an interesting dynamic, I think, between US imperialism and the British in particular, but also French and German imperialism and Japanese. Essentially, again, it's kind of a part of it is like narrative control. In order to look like it was part of a world system of democratic nations, and not an autocratic imperialist power facing down the world's socialist camp, the USA resuscitated, helped to get back on their feet, broken imperialist powers, which essentially after World War II would all have died out. German imperialism was defeated. Japanese imperialism was defeated, Italian imperialism was defeated, French imperialism was nearly destroyed, British imperialism was on its knees, right? All of those powers, you know, on the continent, Japan, if it hadn't been for the dropping of the bombs, would have surrendered partly to the Soviet Union and very likely would have gone partly or wholly socialist after the war, like Germany did. Germany would have gone wholly socialist if it wasn't for the occupation of American, you know, British troops.
Italy, Spain, and Greece were the ones they really had to focus on. They were gone. They were done with imperialism.
So the whole continent of Europe, most of East Asia, in fact, probably all of East Asia, if it wasn't for US interference, would have been communist, right? We'd be in a totally different world. But part of their, so they were the only imperialist power that survived strong after World War II because they hadn't had to do most of the fighting. They talk about their fight. They did barely anything. What they mainly did was make money out of making weapons for all the powers that were weakening themselves. And they were able to come in. They'd resuscitated their economy through the war. They'd built up their industry. They were a growing financial and industrial powerhouse. And I think they were also very embedded with British capital. British finance capital and US finance capital, I think, have become very thoroughly intertwined. So there's a huge amount of capital there that kind of transferred over, I think, from Britain during this whole period. And you end up in a situation where, in order to persuade their own people and peoples around the world that they are the ones who stand for freedom and democracy, they've got to make it look as if there's a whole family of freedom and democracy loving nations. And they resuscitated the old imperialist powers and allowed their ruling classes to carry on being imperialists, helped them back into some of their colonies, right? So that there was a system of imperialist rule of the world and not just, you know, the Americans, who it would then be too obvious that actually they're not a force of, you know, democracy and freedom, and there'd be too many peoples aligned against them. So, you know, it was all about facing down communism and preserving the system of capitalist exploitation, the system of global imperialism. They resuscitated those powers. There was a moment after the fall of the USSR, there was a moment where the European Union had integrated to such an extent and was being able to join in the looting of the former Eastern European socialist countries and the Soviet Union to such an extent, and particularly the Germans. German imperialism really had a field day through the 90s, looting the former socialist republics of Eastern Europe. And there was a moment where the European imperialists started to feel that maybe they would be a separate and independent power from the USA. And you started to see a lot of inter-imperialist contradictions growing, and you started to see the EU trying to have a separate foreign policy and a separate, you know, obviously it had its separate currency that it launched. It wanted to have the separate foreign policy, a separate army. There was a lot of talk about the European army and a lot of it trying to push itself as something different than the USA. And basically that moment passed. And Britain was very much at the center of making sure that a lot of these plans never came to fruition. Britain was the one that vetoed always the European army, for example. And so as the financial crisis of the capitalist global system has reasserted itself, and as the socialist world and the anti-imperialist world is rising, what you now see is this situation where the whole imperialist camp is basically clinging together for survival, right? If the US goes down, they all go down, right? There is no way, you know, there's no way that US goes down and France is somehow surviving and coming up, right? It's not possible. They are totally dependent for the US on military power, and increasingly the only way that they can bring back profitability is through the US's ability to wage war, and they do it together through NATO, but they're very much junior partners, and they have to accept that they're junior partners. They have to take that situation. And I think at the present time, you know, you have a leader in the USA, a regime in the USA that needs to make that clear to the world that they're the boss, right? It used to be that they preferred to hide the fact that the USA is basically the leading partner in all of the imperialist exploits. It's better if we talk about being a fraternity of nations, and if sometimes people have their, go off and do their own thing, and the whole system runs better if we have that kind of an image. And I think it's actually a sign of the weakness of the system that now they have to be very open about the fact that no, everybody's got to toe the line. You've got to be behind America or else. It's not just the Europeans they have to whip back into line. It's the whole of the rest of the world. And, every time it's like, if an oppressed nation, a third world nation, as they call it, gets a whipping, it's also a punishment beating to kind of terrorize the rest of the world, isn't it? And I think there's a little bit of that with the Europeans, this thing of, if Ursula von der Leyen, has to kind of take the knee to Donald Trump, then there's an element to which, it's like a reminder to everybody, look, don't go getting funny ideas. we need to stick together, or there's no way through this. And if that means the Europeans taking, on one level, taking what looks like a really bad deal, on another level, like, this is the only way you survive. You've all got to help prop up America, because America is your only protection actually against the rising world that's going to dethrone not just the USA, but all of us, right? Because if a country can kick the US out, then it can definitely kick out France, Germany, Britain, Italy, right, Spain. It can kick them all out, right? So we're in this situation now where imperialism is so decaying that the inter-imperialist rivalries really end up, like, they're all still there, and you can see that they're still there. You can see the contradictions in the camp. You can see the frustrations, and particularly with the smaller sections of the ruling class in each of those countries. They start talking about being a colony of the USA. Well, it's not quite the right expression, because in fact, all of those countries, their ruling classes live by looting the rest of the world. They live as imperialist parasites, but they've had to accept that in this advanced era of decay, they are very much junior parasites, and they're only allowed to continue being parasites if they make sure that the big parasite gets the biggest feeding frenzy, right? And they all have to work together to facilitate that. And I think we have to recognize also that there is a fundamental difference in the interests, even between a lot of small bourgeois in the imperialist countries and the top finance capitalists who really run everything, the owners of the hedge funds, right? The owners of the hedge funds are the ones who are making all the policy, because they're the ones who really control the whole economy. You might be a capitalist with a factory or some kind of going concern that has, a couple of hundred employees, and you're making good money, and but in terms of the movers and shakers of the economy, you're nobody, right? As far as big finance, international finance capital is concerned, these people are totally small fry, and these are the ones who really make a lot of noise, a lot of fuss, who try to mobilize the discontent of the working class onto their side in a nationalist way and say, "Oh, look, we've been colonized by the USA, and we need to free ourselves." But what they want is to get back to when they were a strong imperialist power. They don't actually have a solution to offer any of their people. They will talk about what's fair and freedom and all these things, and they'll latch onto the frustrations and grievances of their own workers to try to mobilize them. But fundamentally, all they want is to get back to the days, like in our country, we call them the Little Englanders, the ones who liked it, who liked the idea of Britain rules the waves when Britain had the biggest empire. The French, the same, liked it when they had a huge empire and, half the world had to bend the knee to them. So they're not really people who've got any solution or any ability to take us forward. It's far too late for anything like that in the imperialist countries. We have to recognize the only way out of this whole mess is socialism, right? You've got to get rid of the whole system. It's small capitalism is what led to the obscenities of international finance capital that we see today. And there's a logical connection. That's why we always ask people to study Marxism, read Marxist Capital. It's the most incredible lesson in how this system works. But once you've understood these things, you can see there's a direct connection between, the Industrial Revolution and the building of factories and the creation, just the creation of commodities for sale on the market in a systemized way, where that's how all of the commodities and all of the things that you use in society are produced. They're produced for the market, they're produced for profit. That leads step by step from small to concentration to big to huge to ginormous to world dominating, you know, what we see today. And you can't go back to a nicer stage and kind of hold it there. That isn't possible. And also, if you understand the history of capital, you realize there was never a nice stage. It's the whole, Marx says about capital, it came into the world dripping from head to foot in blood, you know, and even the earliest days of the establishment of capitalism, even before the Industrial Revolution, meant genocides abroad. It meant actually genocide of poor people at home, kicking them off the land, and, you know, stealing the land off them and making them into vagrants and essentially slave labor for the towns. So all of this, it's a long way of saying this is a system in crisis, Garland, and we see contradictions appearing between different factions of the ruling class, but fundamentally what they're all wrestling with is how to save a system which is dying, how to stop the working class from getting together, getting organized, from understanding the predicament properly and organizing itself in real, genuine resistance, how to keep them either pacified, distracted, or looking the wrong way, trying to fight but fighting each other instead of fighting the system, how to get them to accept the war drive, how to get them to accept the destruction of their rights, how to get them to accept essentially totalitarian regimes being implemented at home under the guise of democracy and protecting your freedoms. They are taking away all of our rights. They are suppressing dissent in the most fascistic way. And yet, because there's so little working class resistance, they can enact a quite fascistic legal regime without having to have the other accoutrements of fascism, like, organized paramilitary forces on the streets to attack the organized working class, which is a thing we really associate with fascism, isn't it? But in the West, we're not seeing that yet. The police in Britain can arrest people in the most polite way possible and enforce fascistic laws in the most polite way possible, because the working class isn't organized to resist. And I think I won't carry on right now, but I would like us to come back to this question of what the working class needs in order to resist all of this, because this is really the key to our problems right now, I think.
Well, okay, great. Yeah, definitely, we'll come back to that. So let's hit the second part of my question. It had two parts, no honor amongst thieves. And so let's hit the second part, which will probably take us right back to what the working class needs to do. And that's this. We've talked about rules. Oh, we've got the Constitution. It goes back to the Magna Carta and these supposedly rules, a man's house is his castle, whatever, this kind of stuff, right? Then there's international law, which we must abide by. My gosh, the Russians, the Chinese, everybody except us has violated international law, right? Taking these African people to more often than not, puppets in Africa, or people who won't be puppets, are taken to Hague in the International Criminal Court. And what the working class people are finding out is all this idea that there was a constitution. There's no constitution. That there was laws and rules, and that we have a foundation. The Constitution is a foundation because it gives us freedom of speech. Trump just recently said, and they will get away with this, that any state that doesn't basically swear total allegiance to Zionism, if you have an emergency in your state, for instance, a tornado, sorry, no federal funds. You don't get help if you have a flood. None of that. If you haven't pretty much sworn allegiance to Zionism, sorry, your state is no longer part of the United States. You must be a total and complete stint to the Zionist cause, or even though you pay in to this is not someone else's money. I pay my taxes. We could argue whether or not the tax money, but the bottom line is I pay, not for a privilege, but I pay to be part of the system, so that if I have a flood, the money ostensibly, because there's a lot of discussion of that, but allegedly, as I'm told, comes out of that pool back to me to help my town that was just flooded. Nope, What about can I say what I want? Why, we have the First Amendment. They don't have it in Europe. We've got freedom of speech. No, not when it comes to things that we don't like. Interesting. What about England? You have no rights. We can take your house, take your property. We can lock you up. Corbyn and these people are starting a new party. They'll lock them up. They'll outlaw the party. There are no rules. There are no laws. So when I say honor amongst thieves, this facade that this whole system is grounded and founded in a system of rules and laws that we all go by. The ruling elite don't even accept them. I put it this way. They see them as privileges that they grant us. And that on any given Tuesday afternoon, if we no longer deserve the privileges or if it's inconvenient to them, they can retract those privileges. And people are like, but wait, we've got laws and rules. International law, all of that stuff. I think it's a positive thing that is being demonstrated that they do not adhere to any rules or laws, international, national, or anything else.
Totally. You know, this whole superstitious reverence for the law is a really important shibboleth for the working class to break. We have been brought up, trained with this reverence for all the institutions of the state, that there's something that came from God. And even if you don't believe in God, they're like higher than God. They've come from some, you know, Elysian plane, and we are trained to have this superstitious reverence for those things, for the police, for the law, for the judiciary, for all those pillars of state rule. We are taught to wrap ourselves up in this belief that the law is justice personified, that the rules apply to everybody, no matter who you are. That's how you know it's a democracy. These are the things they tell us endlessly when we're growing up. If you have to fight a battle against some injustice, you must learn the law, use the rules, learn the rules, use the rules. The rules apply to everybody, so you must know the rules. The reason the rich can get one over on you is because they know the rules better. So what we're always taught is, if you've got a problem with something, learn the rule book, use the rule book to your advantage, and then if you find the right rule, you'll have them cornered. Total bullshit, isn't it, Garland? It's a way of us wasting our time away. All of us who are angry and righteously angry with things which are wrong with the present system, instead of getting ourselves together and organizing for a system that actually works in favor of the mass of the people, we get caught up in this nonsensical, time-wasting, dead-end activity of trying to understand the rule book, trying to find the right way to use the right rule against the right. Who are the people I've worked out what the rule is I need. Now, who are the people I've got to target at? What's the mechanism I have to find? It's all rubbish because, as you said, the rules are there for the little people to justify the way the state behaves towards the little people. They're not for the people who really run the show. They are above rules. And even when it comes to the way they treat us, they've got so many caveats and things on the side that they can just pick up. Or sometimes they'll just say, because reasons, as we say, right? We had to ignore that rule because reasons. And what are you going to do about it, actually? Just shut up and go. You'll spend the next 10 years running a campaign for how it wasn't right that they ignored one of their own rules, and that will keep you busy. And maybe in 20 years' time, you'll get a victory and someone will apologize. And what will have changed? Nothing. The point is, we got to learn the lesson that the rules are, as we say, rules are made to be broken. The rules are there to keep us in chains and justify that and make us feel that there's some kind of, order that is universal, and that this is really a democracy and the rules apply to everybody. The ruling class doesn't have to stick to its own rules. It can always shoulder a rule aside if it's inconvenient. It's got 1,000 ways to get around being held accountable, including the fact that all the servants of the law are in its employ. So there comes a certain level of society where, the top policeman is not allowed to lick your boots, never mind bloody arrest you. We have to recognize that this is a class society and that there's different rules depending on where you are in that hierarchy. And the 99.999% of us are not in the top, When it comes to international law, it's perfectly obvious that there's no such thing. There was a kind of, again, because of the existence of the socialist camp after World War II, there was a mutually recognized set of agreements around basically the Nuremberg Tribunals and their findings, where the Soviet Union had a strong involvement in pushing for people to be held accountable and pushing for crimes to be recognized, right? So because of the Soviet Union, we have this recognition that, for example, the highest crime against humanity is to wage an aggressive war. What's the USA been doing for the last 30 years? Since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's waged aggressive war after aggressive war after aggressive war, and nobody even blinks. And it's been totally normalized. That's just how it is. And they come up with all kinds of, justifications, and they can't get it through the UN. And so, they create their own coalitions. They can't use international law, so they invent a rules-based international order. It's like a juggling with words, isn't it? There was a thing that people recognized as international law, but it was based on Nuremberg Tribunals and the Geneva Conventions. And these were things that everybody had basically agreed to and signed up to. And while there was a Soviet Union, the imperialists had to pay lip service to those things. Now, the truth is, they never abided by them. They never implemented where they could get away with not implementing them. But in public, they had to pay lip service to all of that. With the fall of the Soviet Union, you see the true face of imperialism kind of unleashed again to the world, the way it was kind of before the Second World War, certainly before World War One. Open, brutal, naked. Might is right. We are right because we are mighty, and we will beat you because you are weak. And that is the face of imperialism, actually. And like I said, they do this juggling with words. So they've got the rules-based international order because they can't talk about international law, because there are some people left alive who actually remember what international law is supposed to mean and can bring you all the ways in which, list you all the ways in which you're breaking international law every single day in all of the wars that you're waging. It's the same way that, we've talked about how the United Nations has basically become, a tool of United States foreign policy. And yet it's not quite enough under their control that they can't, even though there is this thing called the International Court of Justice most of the time, which has got nothing to do with justice, but has occasionally the ability to make a pronouncement that doesn't suit the imperialists. Well, of course, they can't enact it because the Security Council is the only implementing body of the United Nations, and the USA has a veto. So actually the whole of the rest of the United Nations can say something and the USA goes no, and nothing happens, as we've seen. But they set up their own separate international criminal court, right? So there was an international court of justice. It was never particularly any use. It doesn't have like we said, doesn't have an executive body. So it's all hot air anyway. But they've got their own one, so they can control it totally. Even there, they're starting to feel like, oh my God, it's, you can't quite control all the things people there do. They made a point of themselves, the US, of not signing up to it so that none of their people can ever be arrested or tried there. They even passed a law that says if the ICC ever arrests any of our people, we reserve the right to militarily invade The Hague and free them. So it's very much, they've made it perfectly clear, haven't they, that the rules are for everybody else and not for us. All the same, they need a narrative that says we are the people who are for justice. So it's like what I said earlier, in Britain, they're enacting these most fascistic laws, cracking down on people's ability to protest, their ability to speak against the crimes of our ruling class, even the most innocuous, you would think, speech can be stamped on now as terrorism and hate speech. And, they've been running all kinds of test cases, and they're clearly getting ready to institute a parallel kind of legal system to deal with these things more effectively. But they're doing it step by step by step by step. They're normalizing all of these things. And you talked in your show, I saw a bit of your show the other day with Laith Marouf, and he mentioned the arrest of, because obviously he was arrested in Lebanon, but we regularly have arrests of dissident, as they call them, dissident journalists, i.e. journalists who aren't afraid to speak the truth. And one of those, Steve Sweeney, is one of our members. And one of the questions he works for RT. He was covering the Donbass war for a long time. He's now in Lebanon covering the Middle East war front. And he came home to see his family. He's got a child, he's got a mother, he came back to visit them, and he was picked up at the airport and held for, I'm not sure, 24 hours or whatever, and questioned. And one of the questions, apart from asking him if he's loyal to Britain and is he spying, is he a supporter of terrorism, and is he, a stooge of Putin and all these types of things, one of the questions I asked him was, are you a communist? I mean, he's a communist. He's one of our members. Sorry, Steve, if I'm not supposed to say that. But I think it's well known that he's one of our members. But, it's interesting, isn't it, that they have to ask that question. And for now, officially, you're allowed to be a communist in Britain. But who knows for how much longer? And they'll come out with a justification that says, oh, well, it's now support for terrorism to be a communist. And they're not very far away from doing that, Garland, actually. And what I find the most shocking is the working class is so disorganized that they are doing nothing either to oppose any one of these moves that's being made against them. They are, despite massive marches of British people on the streets against the genocide in Gaza, there's no mass movement to actually stop British involvement, which we could do, right? A mass movement of non-cooperation could actually stop all British involvement in the genocide, and that would deal a big blow to the genocidal machine, right? We could do that. We're not doing it because our trade unions have not taken it up as part of their job to do that. We have a leadership that leads us nowhere, that stands at the head, like you've talked about Bernie Sanders and then we have Jeremy Corbyn. People stand at the head and go, oh, yes, things are bad. Well done for coming. See you next time. Oh, we wish things were nicer. Oh, we should. And then now we've got this launch of a new party, right, with Jeremy Corbyn. And what does it actually mean? What it means is the ruling class has worked out that too many people are too angry with the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is too complicit in the genocide for it to be able to get a stable parliamentary majority kind of a vote in the next election. And all of the lefty supporters of Labour are only discrediting themselves by supporting Labour. So how about we make a Labour light, which we all get everyone to put their hope in. And what's the hope? There's all these terrible things happening right now, Garland. Right now, our country is involved in genocide. Right now, we're waging war against Russia in Ukraine. Right now, there's a massive poverty crisis at home. Right now, they're criminalizing dissent as terrorism and locking up journalists, locking up peace activists, right, under the most draconian terrorism laws, and arresting little old ladies in the street who hold a piece of paper who say, I support Palestine action, right? And the mass of the British people are just letting that happen. The trade unions are letting that happen. And instead, all of the lefties, so-called self-identifying left, are saying, yes, another Corbyn project, please. Corbyn, who facilitated the Zionist witch hunt of the Labour Party, facilitated that, headed up the Labour Party, apologised to the witch hunt for his non-existent anti-Semitism and stood back while they unleashed the Zionist witch hunters throughout the Labour Party and expelled massive numbers of Palestine-friendly Labour Party members from the ranks of the Labour Party, right? That was Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, who was supposed to be one of the leaders of the anti-war movement, but when he was leader of the Labour Party and there was a vote in Parliament about whether British troops should directly get involved and bomb Syria, of course they were paying for the proxy war and arming the proxy war the whole time. But there was a vote on direct involvement. And what did Jeremy Corbyn do? Did he whip his MPs to vote? No. Under pressure from the right wing of the party, who said we've got to have responsible grown-up politics, he went, oh, okay, free vote. Vote how you want. Vote with your conscience, i.e. follow the imperialist agenda. Actually, they didn't get their way that time, but it was no thanks to Jeremy Corbyn, right? Jeremy Corbyn, who is supposed to be an anti-war activist, but turned around his apparently lifelong position on NATO. Jeremy Corbyn, who's supposed to be Eurosceptic, but turned around his party's position on the Brexit referendum and said, yes, we'll have a second referendum if I'm elected. Well, that was actually one of the things that really killed his leadership stone dead, was how much hatred that that created for him in the mass of the poor working class in Britain. They were so angry about that in particular. But when it comes to what we're seeing now, the criminalization of anti-Zionism, Jeremy Corbyn was key in helping that situation to be created, that witch hunt to be normalized, the weapon of anti-Semitism to be accepted as something that is a problem in the left, right, and has to be dealt with. And this whole narrative that anti-Semitism is our biggest problem and it's the racism that everybody needs to deal with, you know, it's a total lie, it's a total fabrication. Jeremy Corbyn not only didn't stand up to that, the way that his leadership of the Labour Party while he was there was run, basically red carpeted that narrative. It assisted in creating the regime we are all now fighting. Every one of us who now is an anti-Zionist is fighting now with a whole regime that's been set up of policing us, that if you talk in support of Palestine, you're supporting terrorism. If you talk against Israel, it's hate speech and you're a racist, you're an anti-Semite. All of this, actually, Jeremy Corbyn, who's still held up to us as this great white hope of the working class, he helped them to do that. So what does a new Corbyn project look like? Essentially, we're looking at save social democracy, and saving social democracy actually means saving British imperialism. It's keep people hoping and believing that there's a left wing of British capitalist politics that will rescue you from all the bad things. And all we have to do, there's all these terrible things happening right now. They are basically fascisizing our society. And what are we being told, all of us who are angry about that? Build for 2029 general election. So
but they're saying they want a war with Russia in 2027. So build for the election that will happen after you get nuked and we're all dead.
And after they've gone to war with China, right?
Right.
And let them keep doing all those things they're doing. We'll just pin our hopes that we can vote in 2029 and all our problems are going to be fixed because Jeremy's going to come to number 10. The whole thing is a joke. And say if he even did get a decent number of votes, say if he got into number 10, the most likely thing, one of my comrades lives in Spain, and he says, you know, a lot of European countries, they've ended up in this situation where because like in Britain, but it happened earlier there, the main parties, people lost faith in them. They started to create these kind of left and right alternatives. Yeah. And what they basically do is they attract a whole load of radical angry votes. People, they make people believe that they're really going to change something and they're really anti-establishment. And then with the number of seats they have in parliament, they can't form a government. What do they end up doing? Propping up one of the main parties. So you end up with a coalition that's propped up with all the votes of the people who are angry with the main parties. And actually the coalitions are basically the exact same parties, just they've got these extra separate appendages that aren't that separate after all. And it's all narrative management. It's all keeping us dancing around on the head of this pin. You know, it's all, what is it? You know, moving the decks on the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, right? We're busy. We're keeping ourselves, we're allowing ourselves to be kept busy in this futile activity while the whole damn show is sinking. The world's going up in flames. World War III is actually happening now all around us. And we are being intimidated with the threat of World War III, of something that's in the future. And the ruling class says to us, we're going to save you from this terrible future World War III, but you have to trust us right now, go along with everything we're doing right now. And right now, they're actually waging World War III. And part of waging World War III is waging a really immense and ferocious war against their own working class. And they are normalizing it and getting away with it because our trade unions are doing absolutely nothing.
Well, let's not forget, didn't Macron, so wasn't that party a new party? That was like started and 18 months later it came to power. Burles, what's her name? The woman in Maloney, you know, so these people, all they do is they start a new party every so often and they rename the party something or other. They take off and they just find a way to give us some hope that somehow if you just you usually vote for the same people, the same groups of people, etc. They pluck somebody out of obscurity and put them in the front and say, oh yeah, that person's going to be different. They get in power as long as they have the same owners, the same funders. We did want to get back to what you said, you know, earlier, that you wanted to touch on solutions. what the working class can do now that they're being enlightened, that they're being, as Malcolm X said, they're being had, took, hoodwinked, bamboozled, misled, and led astray.
We're being totally had, Garland. And the leadership of the working class movement, the organized working class, has been thoroughly, co-opted, and they're part of the state machinery, and they're part of a machinery of control over the working class. They don't represent us. They don't represent our interests. They are in the pay of the same people as the politicians, right? And their job is to keep our anger under control and stop us from organizing in our own interests. In Britain, we have a whole plethora of legislation which was enacted initially during the period of Margaret Thatcher, when there was a head-on collision between the government and the trade union movement. And step by step, more and more rounds of anti-trade union legislation were enacted that basically make it impossible to wage a fight that will win. A really meaningful working class struggle to victory is almost impossible now. They've put so many hoops and jumps in the way, and all these legal. And now the trade union leaderships use these laws as a justification for their uselessness. They say, oh, well, this is the best we can do. Oh, well, because we have to fulfill their conditions. We have to do it this way. We have to do it that way. They never will either run a meaningful campaign to get rid of these laws or admit that the only way actually to get rid of these laws is to break them. You can't accept that the ruling, the one right, actually, real right, that workers have in a capitalist system is to organize and withhold their labor. It's the only power we've got in the entire system. If we're not allowed to use that, we're just slaves, right? We have zero power. This I can stand here and talk to you on YouTube, Garland, but I've got no power to change the system by just standing here. And I'll be allowed to talk for as long as I'm not connected to a mass organized working class movement. And the second I am, they'll be switching off my connection and we'll be trying to do this some other way, right? But that's the only real power that the workers have in the system, is the ability to withhold their labor power, the ability to say, I'm not going to work for the bosses until they listen to me. And the only way workers can do that is collectively. That's where the trade union movement came from. Britain has the honor, because we were the earliest really developed capitalist country. We had the earliest proletarian working class movement. We had the first trade unions, real trade union movement and activity started in Britain, right? So we have this long and very proud tradition. But our trade unions today are an absolute travesty. They don't do the fundamental basic things that trade unions were founded to do. They don't enable the working class to withdraw its labor and fight in defense of its pay and conditions, right? The trade unions were not set up to be revolutionary organizations. They're set up to defend the rights of the workers under conditions of capitalism. And the only way they can do that is collectively using their power. We have a trade union movement that won't do those things and consistently bows before the state, before the law, and it's also completely interlinked, interwoven with the Labour Party machinery. So we have this interlinked machinery that controls all working class activity in Britain between the Labour Party and the trade unions and all the little parties that are basically Labour Party hangers-on and trade union hangers-on. Between those, they have this machinery which completely controls every attempt by working people to stand up for themselves. And, I was working with comrades recently in our industrial committee talking about, what is it that the working class needs to do to have unions that are willing and able to fight for their interests, actually. And there's a set of things that they're just indispensable if we want to be able to stand up for ourselves, if we want to be able to stop the war machine, if we want to stop the ruling class being able to force us to pay the price of the economic crisis, which means poverty and austerity and ever worse conditions of housing and healthcare and education and, roads and infrastructure and jobs and everything, just going to rot. And we're paying the price for the decay and the crisis of the system. the first thing we've got to do is break every link between our trade unions and the Labour Party, and kind of, even that includes like kind of Labour light type parliamentarism. You know, this idea that the workers just need to find a friendly MP to fight their corner for them, right? It's this, as one of my comrades says, this is begging. This isn't organizing. This is, you know, find a savior somewhere. And a lot of trade unions will encourage their members to believe that what they need to do is write an early day motion and get an MP to sponsor it, and then he'll, you know, they do this whole massive, it's like what you said earlier about rules, right? Keep us idiots busy, right? That, oh, there's this thing called an early day motion, and if you get an MP to sponsor it, he'll talk about it in the House of Commons. And so what, right? An MP talked about your thing in the House of Commons, and you spent ages lining that all up, writing the motion and chatting up the MP and making it all happen and lobbying and blah, blah, blah. And what happened? 10 minutes of airtime in the House of Parliament when most of the MPs weren't there and no one gave a shit. And next, please, and brilliant. You got to be part of our great British democracy, you know, and now go home and do it all again, right? We got to learn at some point that this is not the way that we are able to defend ourselves, right? We really have to dismantle these Labour-aligned and capitalist-friendly union bureaucracies, and we've got to get rid of all the leaders who have shown that their loyalty is to imperialism. They promote imperialist wars. They loyally serve the ruling class. They sell out every strike that ever happens. You know, we've had, in the last 5 years in Britain, we had so many strikes where the members of the union were giving like 90% mandates for strike action. In the post office dispute back in, I think it was in 2022, there was a ballot, and 90% of those balloted voted for strike action. They were really angry about what was happening in their workplace. Then there was 6 months where nothing. So the union leadership had this mandate to organise some strikes, and they did nothing for 6 months. There wasn't a single day of strike action, and at the end of it, they capitulated entirely and signed up to what was basically the same deal that their members had massively rejected. And, you know, they might have massaged one or two of the points ever so slightly, but they didn't use that power that the workers had even given them. They didn't even try, you know, they just, and there were so many endless stories like that. And of course, one of the things they were doing in that period between 2020 and 2024, one of the things that all the trade union leaders were saying to their members was, we just got to hold on for a Labour government. And then Keir Starmer's promised us, Angela Rayner's promised us that if we just get them in power, they'll change all of this and we won't have to have this fight anymore. So this constant, you know, the leadership is constantly dripping into the members. Number one, demoralization and failure. And on the other hand, this kind of constant chimeric hope. Somewhere in the future, there's the perfect government that's going to do it right, and we won't have to have this fight. So we don't fix our problems by striking, by organizing, by demanding, by using our power to demand that we're treated better and paid better. No, we sit on the side and are victims and demoralized and just find a savior who's going to go into Parliament and through our great democratic institutions is going to deliver our salvation. And of course, that never, ever happens. All that happens is the ruling class has won one more battle, the working class is that bit more demoralized, and these things become normalized, and the workers become cynical. They become used to the idea that their trade union leaders just sell them out. And that's what happens. And there's no point being in a trade union except as personal insurance for just in case, you know, you're unfairly dismissed or something like that, where the union will be your lawyer, essentially. But the idea of collective action, collective bargaining, collective strength in most of the union movement is completely disappeared, right? So another thing, one of our demands is we've got to build up strike funds. You know, when I was in a trade union back some years ago, I'm not going to say the number now, I'm getting older, but I was a trade union rep and a branch chair, and we would constantly talk to our union about, why don't we have a strike fund? I'm like, oh, what do you want from us? But it's insane, isn't it? Like, it's the one thing that unions were founded for, was you pay your subs to build up a fund so that when you need to go on strike, you can get some strike pay and you won't starve. And that enables you collectively to hold out for long enough to force the bosses to talk to you and to recognize that you mean it, right? This is what unions were founded for. And most of them today, they don't have strike funds. And they certainly, if they do have funds, they don't want to use them to pay strikers, right? They're busy investing them in the stock market and trying to do shady business deals with them. They absolutely, you know, are not interested in facilitating the class action of their members, right? So another thing is, you know, there has to be no special perks for union reps. You know, the officials should be paid the average wage of their members, and they need to be subject to recall, right? If the members think they're not doing a good job, we should be able to call them back. Let me tell you this one story, just to give you an idea of how bad democracy has got and how cynical the members have become of our trade unions. There's this Trotskyite, Matt Rack. He was the leader of the Fire Brigades Union. He didn't do a great job there. They weren't very happy with him, but he got shoehorned in, you know, by some organization or other. And he was there. And I think there's an ongoing campaign into corruption during his time as leader. Anyway, he's no longer the leader of the Fire Brigades Union. He's now suddenly been crowbarred in as the leader of another union in a totally different sector. It's a teaching union, right? So he's never been a teacher. He's a career Trotskyite. So some other career Trotskyites have shoehorned him in. Do you know, have a guess, right? The percentage of the union's membership that voted for him to be elected as general secretary?
50.
2.9.
Oh.
2.9% of the members of that NUSWT, it's one of the smaller teaching unions, voted for him, and he's now their general secretary, right? So this guy is a, you know, he's got nothing to do with what trade unionism actually is supposed to be all about, you know. So we need to be able to recall our officers if they're not actually doing a good job for us, for the members, right? And the unions, fundamentally, their job, you know, as well as, you know, defying the anti-trade union laws and making them unworkable, we have to bring back genuine democracy to our unions. We've got to refuse to allow the state to oversee how working class organizations are run. Like, how have we put ourselves in a position where we just go, oh, yes, well, the ruling class gets to inspect our books, gets to inspect our finances, gets to inspect our voting policy, gets to tell us whether or not our votes are legal. That's for us. We're a working class organization. Our members will decide if the vote was right or not. And, you know, back in the day, a trade union ballot was held on the shop floor. The members stood, you know, with their rep, and they voted, yes, we're going to walk out, or no, we're not. And if they voted yes, they walked out. You're not allowed to do that now. They call that now wildcat action, right? Officially, that's against the law, Garland. What's interesting is where it really happens. Sometimes it happens because people are really angry. And when they vote collectively with their feet, if enough of them do it, and they're organized and they're determined, what usually happens is the law doesn't come down on them, because actually the bosses need to negotiate with them and sort the problem out. And that's the point. That's the point of doing that, right? So working class has this power, but the trade unions are helping the ruling class to control the working class. They do this thing where workers are really angry in the workplace. They want to take action. The union bosses say, oh, yes, we hear you're upset. Right, let's have a meeting. Okay, we'll have a meeting in 2 weeks' time. And after the meeting, we'll agree, okay, right, yes, we'll have a ballot. And the state will oversee the ballot, and the ballot will be just, you know, sent from some office somewhere, you know, and it will take, the whole process of balloting will take some months, right? And at the end of the process, if we cross a threshold that's been set by the government, by the state, as, you know, as a legal requirement, if enough people voted, if enough people of the vote who said, you know, then we'll have a mandate. And if we've got a mandate, then we'll discuss what we're going to do with the mandate. Right? And every single stage of that, and there's many other laws as well, right? But every single stage of that is meant to take the fire out of the dispute. There's all kinds of laws about who's allowed to be balloted. So unions very often can't use their real strength. They'll end up finding that the people really affected by the dispute is like 5. So everybody else, we can't even ballot you because it doesn't affect you. You know, all of these ways of chipping and chopping away at working class organization and solidarity and power. It's the only power we have. I'm going to keep saying that, Garland. It is the only power we have in this system, is the weight of our numbers. It's our organization. And we have allowed those organizations and their functioning to be under the control of the enemy class. And we wonder why it is we can't win a battle, you know. And so the working class becomes totally demoralized with all of this, right? And what as well as being able to protect our rights at work, which at the moment they're not doing and not able to, they also need to be leading mass campaigns to defend and restore pay, pensions, working conditions, housing, education, healthcare, utilities, community facilities, all the things we've been losing, right? Legal aid, bloody hell. You know, that should be the job of the organized working class movement. These things are all under attack. The system is in a massive economic crisis. And because of that, they are taking away all of the things they granted to working people. They're seeing them as, you know, it's nice to have, but it's an expense that we don't need. And particularly where it's a service they're delivering and it's not making anyone a profit. So along with cutting budgets for things, they're privatizing things, which means that most of what budget there is goes to somebody's profit, not for delivering a service, right? So things get worse and worse for the working class, even if budgets for some of these services go up, because they're just being siphoned off. We've talked about that lots of times, haven't we? You know, but the unions should be at the forefront of leading organized mass campaigns to defend the working class against these constant attacks. And instead, we are left defenseless because we're weak individuals, right? And then, of course, there's the requirement to lead a mass campaign of non-cooperation, obstruction and sabotage of the war machine, the Zionist genocide, you know, the British, NATO, Israeli genocide and war machine. Absolutely, the trade unions should be at the front and center of organizing a mass campaign of the working class to refuse to cooperate with all aspects of the war machine. We absolutely could do it. We absolutely should be doing it. It's the leaderships and the bureaucracies of our unions and the misleaders of all our so-called mass working class organizations, which stand in the way of workers being able to use that power that they actually have. You know, and we really need to we need to recognize this, that if we're not careful, we're these people who pretend to be the leaders of the working class, they're actually, you know, they're handmaids to fascism. I'm sorry to say it, but they are facilitating the implementation of a totally fascistic regime rather than helping us to organize to reject it. And we really have to start paying attention and doing something about that and recognizing that the enemies within our midst are in fact more dangerous than the enemies who are obviously outside our camp. It's the Jeremy Corbyns, actually, who are the most dangerous enemies of all, because he's a wolf dressed in sheep's clothing. He's pretending to be what he isn't. And we only have to look, as you said, at what happened with that Unite Against Fascism, you know, the National United Front that they did in France last year. I think it was last year. And what happened? What happened was they ended up propping up Macron to keep out the fascists. Macron is the one who's actually enacting all the fascist legislation right now. Macron, who was the one who they were supposed to be formed to oppose, right? The whole point of this big, you know, left front was supposed to be to destroy Macron, who everybody hated and whose regime everybody hated. And instead, under the threat of fascism, they ended up propping up the very thing they told all those people that they were going to help them to destroy.
I'll just end up by saying this about the leadership of these so-called, you know, the trade unions and the leadership of some of these organizations. During World War II, the U.S. intelligence agency said, we think we've got German spies on the waterfront in New York. How can we, this is the story that was told, how can we address that? This is the way the story goes. Sure, there's a lot more to it than this. So they were told, you've got to go to the mafia. They control the union. So they went to the mafia and they said, hey, we want to deal with the waterfront. And the mafia said, it's Lucky Luciano, but you put him in jail. So the intelligence, supposedly naval intelligence, brought Lucky Luciano out of jail and said, we need help. We're going to give you lists of German spies and we want bad things to happen to them. We want them to disappear. Okay, so supposedly that what we're to believe is during World War II, the intelligence agencies worked with the mafia, who was in charge of the unions. Interesting. And which kind of means that the intelligence agencies and the mafia were working together, co-running the unions, right? And they were using them for national security, of course, to stop these German spies. Okay. And Americans know, for instance, the guy that killed Kennedy's alleged shooter was Jack Ruby, who was what? Lifelong mafia. The intelligence agencies, mafia, Havana, Cuba, Need I continue? Right. So what we see is a very, very long history of the intelligence agencies working arm in arm with the mafia, hand in hand with the mafia, right? At the same time, complaining that the mafia is in charge of the unions. But who's in charge of the mafia again? You see what I mean? So basically, they argue, well, the bottom line is if the mafia was running the unions and the people in charge didn't want the mafia in charge of the unions, for some reason, they can infiltrate the mafia anytime they want to. They can tap their phones, tap everything, and take them out and arrest them and stop them from this crime, except when it comes to the unions. We also have a long history in the US of intelligence agencies and law enforcement making deals with the mafia, making deals with drug cartels such as El Chapo, saying you can bring drugs into here, sell this, do this if you give us information on this. So there's this symbiotic relationship historically between the mafia and the intelligence agencies. Let me get back to this. But what we're told is, quick story. At one time, I was being talked to about doing a TV show in this area. And I was told if you can find funding, you can get that. So anyway, one of the things I was told is go to this guy. He's in this huge union and he can get you the funding. Went and talked to the guy and the guy said, sure, I'll talk to these guys. We can get you the funding, whatever it is. But he kind of stopped and looked at me. He says, but you know, they're mafia, right? You know, like, okay, we can get you the funding, no problem. But you understand, literally, he said, but you know, they're mafia, right? I'm like, oh, okay. When he called me back, I said, you know, I don't think I want to do a TV show, but, you know, I'll look up, blah, blah, blah. I dropped the whole project. In other words, it was well known. It's obvious they're mafia. But if that's the case, then the people in charge, and this guy, you know, lived well, drove a Mercedes, big home, the whole 9 yards, right? Then it's obvious to me that the intelligence agencies keep the mafia in charge of the trade unions so they can have plausible deniability and they can at the same time demonize the leadership of the trade unions.
Totally. And we don't have the exact analogous situation here, but what we do have is a working class movement that's absolutely riddled with state agents and whose leadership, whether they know it or not, are all bought off by the same ruling class and acting in their interests, not in the interests of their membership. They act consistently against the interests, against the wishes of their members, in the interests of the Labour Party. The Labour Party acts in the interests of imperialism. So you have this kind of chain of command and control. And they are, as I said earlier, a mechanism for control of the working class and actually for discipline of the working class. And, you know, just to come back to something we've talked about many times before as well, Garland, this whole scapegoating and demonizing of immigrants is also a mechanism for disciplining the working class. It keeps us all, whether we're immigrants or not, on not just accepting poor wages, but on our toes and scared of the state, right? And when we buy into the idea that it's a good idea and we allow the state to viciously target sections of workers in our midst, actually what we're doing is normalizing the state's use of very brutal violence against workers generally. Because, you know, the day they turn around and use that violence on you, it's too bloody late to say, oh, it's not really right for the state to be so vicious and violent and repressive, isn't it? Now, we're doing exactly that. On the one hand, you're seeing, you know, the ICE raids and, you know, we have our equivalents here, you know, of rounding up certain types of immigrants and scapegoating them and, you know, whipping up people into a fever against certain types of immigrants. And then at the same time, we have this normalizing of the treatment of protests as something criminal, the treatment of civil action, civil disobedience as terrorism, you know, and all of this, you know, using of the entire state machine to crush dissent. And just because they're doing it to small sections of the population and they're creating this huge narrative to justify it, but for each one of those we allowed to go by, we're creating a situation where by the time they come for you, there's nobody left to speak out for you. And you've allowed this machinery to become totally normalized. And, you know, it's going to be too late. It's going to be too late for a lot of people when they suddenly wake up and realize, oh, I've just thought that maybe this is a bad idea.
Thank you very much, Joti. Tell everyone where they can find you online.
Thank you. So I have a Telegram channel, Joti Brar. It's just my name there. My party has a Telegram channel also, The Communists with an S, the same. You see our website URL there, thecommunists.org. please come. Please subscribe to our newspaper, Proletarian. You can sign up for email updates. You can follow our updates on the Telegram channel, but the best thing is to subscribe to the newspaper, because there's nothing like having physical copy in your hands. And you can find our videos, huge range of material on all kinds of topics on Proletarian TV on YouTube, and we're across various other platforms too.
And I will leave with the same statement I started with. And then we have a statement. Everyone should meditate for 30 minutes a day, unless they don't have time, and then they should meditate for an hour. If there are people in the chat, oh, I disagree, socialism's bad, blah, blah, blah. Everyone should watch this hour with Joti Brar. Unless they completely disagree, then they should watch it twice and take notes. Joti Brar, thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Everyone, follow me on Telegram and Rockfin and Rumble and all that kind of stuff. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you. We're out. Well, no, we're not.